I can't think of a single scenario where the situation we found ourselves in or the adversary that we were up against felt, at least internally, like we could go to zero. Because the product we put out in the world is the best, most productive use of their time right now, and they're choosing to do that. But when your customer is like needing you to deal with something in the real world, a real problem they have on either side of the market, well, I mean, how could we not survive through a PR issue? How could we not survive some regulatory challenge? Because people want this, they need this. They've decided what we've built is the right thing for them. A players hire A players and B players hire C players. That's what people are willing to pay for and spend time on. Well, geez, if we're not figuring that out, what business do we have being a business? Travis said from the very beginning, we are never going to celebrate a fundraise. This was Las Vegas.
Hey, Dom, welcome back. It was great hosting you and want to host you again. Can you talk about a little bit in details about some of the instances where like something happened and like Uber might have gone to zero, like maybe the employees thought about it, or let's say the public perception was like maybe that Uber can go to zero from the kind of hot startup it was. Can you talk about those things and how did the team like overcome those circumstances?
Yeah, so I would first say I'll kind of give some of my impressions on when I thought it might go to zero or not, and I don't, I can't necessarily speak for everyone, but this is kind of a little piece of it. I would say, first of all, I can't think of a single scenario where the situation we found ourselves in or the adversary that we were up against felt, at least internally, like we could go to zero. I think that's true across legal issues, regulatory issues. We had even major competitors, well-funded, successful competitors. I think that there were a couple of reasons for that internally. First of all, we were talking previously on kind of hiring super smart people and just kind of setting them free. And I think that tone, like that was something that was well understood by everyone. The expectation was that we were hiring the best, the filtering in interviews that we were hiring the best. And so I think, at least maybe for me personally, anytime there was an issue, I kind of just felt like, well, we have the best lawyers, and so they'll figure this out, or we have the best policymakers, they'll figure this out, or on the engineering side, the system fell over. Well, we've hired the best engineers, like they'll figure this out. These externalities, as bad as they could be, like there's got to be some path through them. Like there's kind of an optimism that was just inherent kind of internally. And even more so when the type of external threat especially was like regulatory or PR or whatever the media happened to write about in the day. What I would always settle back on was the fact that at this, I would think these thoughts. I remember doing this, like at this moment in time, I'd look at some graphs. There are however many tens or hundreds of thousands of drivers online right now, right? And there were however many tens or hundreds of thousands or whatever rides finished in the last minute. Like this exact last minute, those numbers obviously changed over time, the graphs grew over time, but the concept was always the same. And I would always kind of sit back and think to myself, well, if there are riders or potential riders maybe out in the world who are choosing to use what we built right now, not because someone's twisting their arm or compelling them, or they got 100% off promo, but because it's the best solution to their transportation need right now. And similarly, there are drivers in the world right now who turned on that app. They're sitting in their cars with their app on right now because the product we put out in the world is the best, most productive use of their time right now, and they're choosing to do that. Well, my God, then we better figure out whatever else we have going on, whatever issues we need to do to get through this, because we kind of have an obligation to them to keep operating as a business, to keep building new things on product. Like every company is customer centric and it's really cliche at this point. But when your customer is like needing you to deal with something in the real world, a real problem they have on either side of the market, well, I mean, how could we not survive through a PR issue, or how could we not survive some regulatory challenge? Because people want this, they need this, they've decided what we've built is the right thing for them. And so I don't know, I think that was where this optimism, this endless well of optimism perhaps came from for me personally. And I would say that was certainly reflected in other people all the way up to Travis, just as things were talked about as stuff came up in meetings. But I don't know, there was never a doubt. There were always naysayers, there were always detractors, but there were also so many users and the number is growing every day on both sides of the market. This thing can't go to zero. If for no other reason than because we have to figure this out. We have an obligation to the people who want this.
Well, I think that's a very positive and strong way of looking at it, right? One is like your core product is such awesome that people are using it. And then on building on that, like you can't take anything as an obstacle. You'll have to just solve it, right? That's really nice.
Yeah, your customers expect it of you. That is what I mean. We're an innovative tech company because we solve problems, right? And maybe that's a routing technical algorithm that needs to happen, or maybe it's figuring out how to operate in this city. But if that's what people want, that's what people are willing to pay for and spend time on. Well, geez, if we're not figuring that out, what business do we have being a business?
Wow, cool. That's super interesting. Can you talk about how in the initial days, Uber actually hired talented people all across the globe? And like what kind of incentives they used to give and the kind of growth trajectory the people saw in their career? Can you talk on those fronts?
Yeah, absolutely. With the caveat that I didn't spend a ton of time on kind of end recruiting. Like by the time there were candidates in, I interviewed and such. But I didn't. Sometimes we had tactical things like university recruiting I participated in, but I wasn't doing like super strategic stuff. So I'll make some guesses here. First of all, I'll say we had a ton of talent come in, both on the engineering side and on the rest of the business, that was strictly referral based early on. I think that was just based on some expectations that it was a kind of a weird, like the types of roles we had were not commonly found in other companies, especially on the operations side. And so the best way to find talent was going to be to have someone like talk to you about it, tell you this is cool, probably work there themselves. And like that was a good pathway for people to come in. We did have kind of stock-based bonuses, referral bonuses early on that ended up being pretty significant. They were small at the time. As the value of the stock grew, those became huge. And there were people who really just spent a lot of time on that. I know some early operations folks who ended up earning more equity through the referral program because they had people successfully come in than they did kind of like through their initial employment grants. Just as a side note, it was decided that would be a priority for the business. Hiring smart people meant they probably also knew smart people, and so lean on that was something we decided to do. I think I don't know who said the quote originally, but a bit of a cliche but common statement that like A players hire A players and B players hire C players. And so, that was very much kind of a mentality. We're hiring smart people. They know smart people. Like, let's just use that as the first pathway, and then, fill in with a broader kind of recruiting infrastructure where, maybe where we don't have kind of internal talent already. Other than that, I honestly couldn't tell you kind of like how our new hire grants kind of compared elsewhere in the market. I just don't have a sense. I wasn't interviewing and getting packages elsewhere, and I wasn't really putting our packages together. I do remember very, very early on, like maybe right after I came in full time, I do remember there was some frustration. For whatever reason, it seemed like we were losing a lot of candidates to Square early on. Just the name kept coming up. They were relatively young as a company, but they were 1 or 2 funding rounds ahead of us. And so their valuation was very big. They could give out big dollar amount stock grants. Things obviously evened out in the end. But I just remember like there were certainly challenges as an early company, as a young company, if for no other reason than because, there were some technical write-ups in TechCrunch and stuff, but there were also a ton of write-ups of like early regulatory challenges. And so getting someone to become a candidate to kind of not just be comfortable with the idea of the company and the mission and moving people around, but where it operates, kind of related to your previous question, what are the chances it goes to zero? Sometimes that did take more discussion, more going for coffee with someone or grabbing lunch with someone before they're even into an interview loop. It was also just like part of the job. I think there's an interesting kind of dichotomy here where on one hand, speaking to myself on engineering, like the systems are strapped, business is growing faster than engineering can keep up. Like we're already running around with our hair on fire, trying to keep the system afloat. And you want me to spend an hour, like not with my hands on the keyboard, like talking to someone in a conference room? But on the other hand, like that's the only way the team's going to grow. And that's the only way I'm going to have more time is if I can hire more talent. So, we had to really figure out what that balance was. And, I think if anything, it's hard in retrospect. I try not to like apologize for things we did before, because certainly everyone was trying their best. It would have been better if we could have hired more faster. But at the same time, that's impossible for me to say now because time spent hiring is time spent away from doing something else. And the business was stretching everyone in 100 directions.
Yeah, that's true. Can you talk about the kind of standards that was laid starting from the top, right, from Travis and from the leadership, the high standards that they kept, and the kind of how did it encourage the people around, right? And what was the culture in terms of working hard? And I believe like it's very well known that Uber used work hard and party harder, right? Can you talk about some of the instances of where you actually had to work super hard and then like you had great celebrations and all?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with kind of the bar that was kept on the hiring front when someone's coming first in, and then move into what that meant kind of as a regular employee, is kind of an ongoing basis. These days it's interesting to contrast now, 12 years past, 10 years later, than some things. These days we have really robust engineering competencies and these different aspects of what it means to be an employee in a certain role and different levels, and like bullet points of examples of what these mean, and senior is different from junior in these ways and all this stuff. And that, obviously, like, maybe not obviously, I shouldn't say that. Like, that was not the case at the beginning, right? Someone has to invent all that stuff. You have to invent not just the titles and the ladder and the hierarchy, but like, what does that mean? And what does that mean for engineering or data science or a designer or an ops person? Like, these don't all flow together and there's no kind of single manual. And so in a recurring theme that I keep coming back to, early on, there wasn't that stuff. And so the only option we had was to lean on a very like human side of the business, right? I didn't interview for probably the first 3 or 4 or 5 years, or maybe 3 or 4 years, not because I didn't want to. I volunteered all the time, but I was not a particularly senior engineer. I was fresh out of school. Like, could I take some rubric maybe and apply it to a problem in the room? Maybe, but like, no one had written the rubric yet, right? So the early interviewers were senior people who had spent a bunch of time in engineering at other companies and had kind of intrinsically an understanding of not just what did the team need operationally, but what types of individuals and how to test for that in an interview. It was only years later that we even had like an internal class on how to interview and the right kinds of questions to ask, the kinds of questions you're not allowed to ask, but also like how to judge criteria that matches what our expectations are of these roles now that that's been developed. And so, this is all part of a company growing and maturing. Isn't just the business going like this on core metrics. It's about figuring out what these internal processes are, and not just what the process is, but what kind of the education of the employee base is to kind of facilitate that process. And so I had to figure out all these things along the way. What also comes from that, though, is without kind of that robust documentation that's broad and touches on all of these different aspects of engineering, and I just keep coming back to engineering since that's where I was, but these things were happening across all roles within the company. But because those documents are very granular and can tell you a lot of the different details if you're reading this for the first time, and there's only so much until someone develops that material that a leader, or whether that's Travis at the top or even within individual orgs, can really impact these things. You can't spend 2 hours once a week in the company all hands talking about what the priorities are for engineering and what the hiring philosophy is going to be. Like, it's just not, there isn't time for that level of depth always. And so, you have to figure out as a leader, again, whatever that means within your org, kind of how do you spend as much time, like enough time to give everyone the right context and the right philosophy, but then hand off that to whoever is on the front line of that, whether it's a recruiter or someone doing a phone screen and doing an interview. So the form that this tends to take is from the very top, there will be, some strategies or some company values or norms or something like that that's stated. And then you just kind of have to figure out what that means kind of within your area. But at the same time, like, there's a cost to getting that wrong, right? Because it's not, Travis doesn't not have expectations. He just can't be in every meeting with engineering, with recruiting, to say, yes, this resume matches what we're looking for. No, yes, this interview loop does or doesn't, have success. But if you hire the wrong people, like, you still did the business wrong. And so you kind of got to get that right. But I just keep coming back to, like, you hire smart people, you set them off on any number of internal tasks that need to happen. This is one of them. Eventually, you get to the point where you've had time to build out kind of some of this infrastructure around recruiting, this infrastructure around the hiring bar. And then in the right scenarios, those thresholds around hiring and those expectations around role and tenure and responsibility, those also carry through to full-time employees as well, right? You want a consistency between the person who's being hired at the L5 level and the person who is internally promoted to the L5 level. And that, I mean that both from expectations of the role as well as like compensation. And some of these things are nebulous and hard to figure out from the outside on a different team or not as a manager, whether we're matching this correctly and all of those pieces. But getting that wrong is something that people kind of feel and the organization feels when there's a disconnect. And so you got to spend some time on it, even though it might not feel like the most productive work. It's not the same as writing a line of code or launching a new city, right? It's much more internal. We didn't touch on, do you want me to touch on work hard, play hard? Another cliche that seems to hit us pretty frequently. I'll say a couple things about this. First of all, I was speaking earlier around like criticality of the customer and obligation of the customer. I want to start with that in this answer, even though it sounds like the opposite of the fun times we're going to talk about, because while we did play hard a bunch of different dimensions, it was either maybe in service of the customer, maybe not directly, or at least in recognition to part of your question on like positive impact on the customer. A specific example that really continues to resonate with me is, every tech company for the most part raises money. Normally, when you raise a new round of funding, you put out like a big press release, excited about how much money you were able to extract out of venture capitalists, and it must mean that you're incredibly successful and you're doing great stuff. And then you throw some huge party, and you spend a ton of that money on champagne, and that was not us. That was very much not us. Travis said from the very beginning. He said this very explicitly in all hands with some frequency. He said, we're never going to celebrate a fundraise. We're just not going to do it because that's not what we're here to do. Raising money is an obligation. It is a responsibility that we now have to perform more, to perform better. It means we need to work harder and we need to earn the cashes that we were just given. It's a little bit backwards, but we need to work to earn that. And so that in of itself is not a cause for celebration. What is a cause for celebration is large, like measurable impact on the customer. And so what we would do instead of having, a Series A party and a Series B party, like a lot of companies did, we set out and kind of figure out like what is the single most core metric of like the business and the business growth. We settled on gross bookings. So just total money in. And we cheat a little bit because we would say on an annualized basis, right? So take the last week or take the last month. If we did that for a whole year, how much money did the business take in from the demand side of the business? And so we said, okay, every time, how about this? Every time annualized gross bookings surpasses an order of magnitude, let's throw a party. Let's have the whole company come together, celebrate this milestone, this impact that we've had, and acknowledge that, we need to do more work to get to the next order of magnitude, because that's 10 times harder than what we just did, right? We need to do what we just did 10 times over to get there. And so we did this kind of 3 times in our history. In the very early years when the order of magnitudes are small, we hadn't really come up with this yet. But the first one was we did a full company trip to Tahoe. I don't remember the year off the top of my head. It was probably maybe 2012 or 2013, somewhere in there, relatively early on. And this was to celebrate, it was 10 to the 8th. This is what we called it because we're math nerds. So this was hitting, I guess that would be $100 million bookings run rate. Whole company was 400 people at the time, maybe half of those in San Francisco. The rest were in cities spread throughout the world. But, rented a couple houses next to each other. And I think it was maybe the back half of half a week, Wednesday through Friday or something off the top of my head. It was, about half of it was like just pure socializing, meals out and stuff like that. And there was a component that was a little bit productive. It was actually, as a side note, it was in the lead up to a major writer app redesign that hadn't finished yet. And so the whole mobile team was there, but they had their own house and like no one was allowed in it because they were working for most of this thing. Maybe there's an example of play hard and working hard happening at the same time, but with different groups. But that was kind of one example of we're gonna celebrate this milestone. So we did it again. Can't remember 18 months later or something. The next order of magnitude 10 to the 9th. This was an interesting one actually because we went to Miami for it, and Uber was not live in Miami at the time. And so again, maybe matching the play hard, work hard, play hard. part of that event, that one I know was over a weekend, Friday through Sunday or something. Part of that event on Saturday was for people to go off and literally canvass neighborhoods. Like we put mailers, like door tags on doors that literally said, like, this is what Uber is. This is why we're not in your city yet. Here, like, you are in District 19, whatever. Here is your representative. Like, call them and tell them to change this law. And it was kind of cool. We went out and we did that wearing, Uber stuff. And sometimes someone would be like on their lawn watering their grass, and they'd be like, "What is this thing?" And and you'd talk with them for a minute. It was like it was a different side of personal of the experience. And then on the flip side, at the night, in the evening, we'd go to clubs and have big dinners and like whatever else you do in Miami. We had a big party at I think it was literally, we'd rented out a hotel just because like it worked headcount wise. I don't know if we were maybe I'm gonna make up some numbers, somewhere on the back half of 1,500 or 2,000 people, maybe short of that, maybe 1,500 people, something like that, 12 or 1,500. And so like you kind of, you need a building. And so, had a big catered dinner by the pool deck. Everyone wore white. It was fun. And then the last one that we did, I don't even remember the date, 2015, maybe 2016, was 10 to the 10th, X to the X. We got into Roman numerals. It was very fun. This was Las Vegas. It was like, I don't know, 2,000 people or something. It was massive. This one was actually more structured like a real conference. The play hard part was really relegated only to the evenings, to the night times, and that was mostly on your own, except we did have Beyonce perform a concert. But the day times were very much conference-like. There were a ton of different sessions. Leaders from across the org kind of talked about their work, and it was a way to kind of collaborate in areas that you wouldn't really otherwise. I just remember a particular highlight was I went to a talk by Emil Michaels, who was head of biz dev. And he basically just did like an hour session on how biz dev happens. How do you arrive at a deal, like with senior executives from other companies who might be adversarial, might be not, and like your goal is to find common ground, and like you're never really going to extract concessions. You want to both leave the conversation feeling like you're both better for it. And it was just like a really interesting thing around how to structure negotiations and the prep that goes into it, and research to find out what the other person wants ahead of time and being prepared for that. And it was like very, very cool. And so there's just a ton of content like that, these were always occasions to meet people who you had only interacted with digitally, maybe even before remote work. The company was very remote because people were in cities around the world. And so it was just a chance to overlap, kind of relearn that we're all in this together. Oftentimes in these, there would be, in this Las Vegas one, Travis introduced kind of new values kind of for the business that evolved from some previous ones. And so like, that's a time for everyone to be together, kind of realign on everything that's going on. And so, yeah, for sure. Was there play hard? Absolutely. But it was always kind of on the back of either good work done or good work that needed to happen next. A class of new hires came in, and after they finished their onboarding, everyone goes out to dinner and then has some drinks, and it's all like, yeah, we got a lot to do, but we're all going to do it together. And this is kind of how it's going to feel. And so it was great. It was good.
In terms of individual achievements, or let's say team milestones achievements, right? Like, did you actually celebrate internally within your teams? How was that going on? And I actually want a little deep on the team culture and how do you celebrate for each other?
Yeah, so this is a great one because there are many flaws in Uber structurally early on. One of them, I think, particularly was that there was not a lot of consistency in the answer to this question that you're asking. This, especially early days, as I was saying, if there isn't structure yet, there isn't kind of strong policies on things, you're basically at the bequest of whoever your leadership team is, kind of up the org chart, whatever they've seen and done before, and kind of what they're, what they want to do and how they want to run their org. And so some teams were quite good at individual recognition, major project recognition. Other teams, it'd be someone brings in donuts on launch day, and like that's kind of the end of the pomp and circumstance. It was very different. I would say some of the best leaders I worked for, one of the aspects that made them great, and one person I'm thinking of in particular, was, I guess it was like the mechanism by which they recognized, and not necessarily kind of the magnitude, if you will. It wasn't the amount of spend that the team did to go out to dinner, but like kind of how nuanced or how carefully and maybe how differently based on project or based on individual recognition happened. As a very specific example, I worked very last minute at the tail end of a project that I think we've written about publicly, called it Project Mezzanine. We were basically, we had basically run out of room in our primary database, and the trips table, which by its name stored every trip ever done, was the biggest table kind of by a long shot. And so like that thing had to go, right? We had to put that somewhere else, more scalable. A single Postgres instance kind of had met its match. And so there was this effort. It really took months. I came in at the very end of it, tried not to ruin everything that they had done previously. Months-long effort to kind of write not just a new system, but do this migration out of the core piece. And I actually can't remember why I got pulled into this at the end, but I came in like literally in the final week of this project. I noticed some glaring issues, one of which was that were written kind of in the code base were still like the tests stood up their own MySQL table. And so like no one had rewritten the tests to use the new trip writing and reading paradigm. And so I think everyone was just expecting that test passing meant the new stuff they were writing worked, but it wasn't pointing at the new thing. It was pointing at the old thing. And I recognized this on like a Tuesday, and I'm like, this is bad. Like, how do we have any confidence here? It was the first time since my anecdote in our last session on launching Paris that I did an all-nighter, two all-nighters in a week, kind of in the office. And this, to be fair, this was 2015, maybe something around that. Like the company was large, felt mature, felt like we were well past doing all-nighters. But this, there was a line in the sand. Everyone thought we were going to get there. I figured out this was not the case. And so I spent, I think it was literally two nights in a row in the office. The recognition that I'm not a big public recognition person. The manager on this project, who I had only worked for 48 hours at this point, kind of knew that or learned that, whatever. At the tail end of this project, his recognition of my contribution was a all expense paid dinner out with my wife at a restaurant of my choice in town. Because he said, and this, hit some high notes with her as well. He said, like we could do whatever we want. I can send an email out that puts your name on there. I don't think that matters to you. But more importantly, I want her to know that we kept you away from evening obligations, normal non-work obligations. And we appreciate that you rose to the occasion for that, but it wasn't only your sacrifice, it was hers too. And so he literally, he actually asked permission. He said, may I buy dinner, or may Uber on my behalf, I buy dinner for you guys on a night out. And it was perfect, right? It was exactly the right thing that kind of rose to the occasion. And so I think that, my big takeaway from that was that there are different forms of this. Absolutely, there's a camaraderie for doing a big project, launching something major together. It's fun to celebrate that together, but it doesn't just have to be how many dollars are spent on this dinner or the cake we brought into the office to celebrate this thing. There can be a much more nuance to it, but it only comes from a manager being involved, knowing the people on the team, knowing what people want and what about their work resonates with them, what else is going on in their life. And so, there's a lot of dimensions to this. And then at the same time, even going back to where I started on what is documented, what is company policy, I don't even know that you could capture all of this in a policy, right? Because as soon as you write a policy that's like, you let your employees take their spouses and significant others out to dinner after a project, it kind of loses some of the meaning. And so, going back to leaning on people and having smart people, having bright people, that's across all dimensions, not just technical, giving them some room to do what they see fit in a situation can be super powerful if you've got the right people on the team.
Yeah, that's super sweet as well, right? If you have it in the policy first, it's very expected. There's no surprise element in that, and there's no emotions in that as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll continue on this journey in the next episode. If you liked it, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so that you get notified when the next episode is up.